Well, great. It's 1 o'clock. We'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this discussion of Ashrae versus Iecc in terms of the lighting and electrical provisions of the energy codes. Our learning objectives are mostly focused today on lighting, but we will cover electric, which is a smaller portion of the code. We'll talk about the major organizational differences between Iecc and Ashrae and how the documents relate to each other, and we'll understand similarities and differences in lighting power density requirements, and we'll also understand differences in lighting controls, including under number 4, daylighting controls. If you're interested in continuing education credits, be on the lookout for those. They'll probably come out Thursday or Friday when we post the recording of this event. And on that note, we will be recording and it will be available for you through that email and also through our YouTube channel, which is CDAC Illinois, and on our website, which we'll talk about in a second. Feel free to post questions in the Q&A. Oh, which we already have a question, actually. Thank you, James. Will there be a discussion on the controls side to the energy code? Yes, that will be probably a large part of our conversation. We'll be talking about the similarities and differences in the controls in Ashrae and Iecc. So be on the lookout for an email if you're interested in continuing education credits or if you'd like to reference the recording. We are the Smart Energy Design Assistance Center. We're an applied research program of the University of Illinois in Champaign. Our mission is to reduce the energy footprint of Illinois and beyond. And so to that end, we do educational programming like this, our other energy code support projects and other projects, energy assessments and community support throughout the state. We would like to thank the Illinois State Energy Office, who is sponsoring not only this program today, but also our program in general, which provides a variety of energy code support, including our technical support line. So this email here is very useful if you have questions. Please feel free to reach out to us about any of your energy code questions, and we'll put our heads together and get you an answer as soon as we can. You can also call us on the 1-800 number if you prefer to discuss your question. And we also have a bunch of online resources. So at smartenergy.illinois.edu/energy code, you'll find a variety of resources from workshops and webinars, both the upcoming and, as I mentioned, we post our past workshops and webinars, so you can always reference those. And if you're looking for to brush up on a topic, but you'd also like to get some continuing education credits, our online courses are a great option. So if we don't have a workshop or webinar on a topic you're interested in exploring and you'd like some no-cost CEUs at the same time, we've got online courses. And technical support, that's our hotline. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. We're always happy to answer those. And then we have some resources on the website, including frequently asked questions. If you want an instant answer, there may be one there for a common question. And also we have some useful websites, which are a link to the text of the International Energy Conservation Code, which is the model code for our Illinois Energy Code. And then we have the amendments linked on that page, and also the Chicago Energy Conservation Code. So, go to the bookmark the CDAC website so you can find and bookmark these useful websites as well. Since we're talking about Ashrae today, we also wanted to mention where you can preview versions of the Ashrae code. We're talking today, as I mentioned, about the 2019 Ashrae standards. So you'd find that under their current standards because the 2019 is the current Ashrae standard, but the 2016, as many of you may be aware who are currently using the Ashrae standard, is the one which is referenced in our current Illinois Energy Code. But we're talking today about 2019, which hopefully won't throw you guys off too much. But as we expect that the 2021 Iecc is going to be adopted in June 2022, so just over 6 months from now, we expect that folks are already looking at that code and getting ready for it. And we also are always encouraging folks to do that little bit more efficiency if you can than the minimum. So we'll try to point out when the 2019 Ashrae indicates an amendment from 2016 or something that's going to be caught up with the 2021 Iecc. But we will be talking today about the 2019 Ashrae and the 2018 Iecc. So keep that in mind. So why are we comparing these two codes? We wanted to talk a little bit about how they relate to each other and some of the technicalities of, what is Ashrae and how does it relate to Iecc? Why do we have these two documents to choose from? So first of all, for your commercial buildings, you have two paths for energy code compliance in the state of Illinois, because Illinois has adopted the International Energy Conservation Code with amendments to create our Illinois Energy Conservation Code, conveniently, both Iecc. So our the model code is our code, it's our state law. And in the text of that code, the Iecc has adopted Ashrae as a standard that can be used to show code compliance. So for commercial buildings, you have the option of using the Ashrae 90.1 standard to show compliance. But we always like to remind you, you couldn't pick, maybe you like the lighting requirements from Ashrae, you can't take those, and then the Iecc envelope requirements. So can't pick and choose, but you do have these two options. So that's why we're comparing them today to discuss, some of the differences and similarities in applying these. And I think, I want to remind you guys about our last, so we have our series in the Ashrae versus Iecc is, we have one more event after today's, and that's performance-based compliance. So please do join us for to learn about performance-based compliance in the two codes and how they are the same and how they're different. And today we're talking about lighting and electrical. So registration is here, and hope to see you for that event. So again, we have two paths. There's 2018 Iecc, or currently the 2016 Ashrae is an alternative. But we're talking today about 2019 Ashrae as we prepare for the next code cycle and 2021 Iecc. So just understanding as we step into these two different codes, we want to understand quickly how they're organized. If we're opening up these code books, where are we going to find the requirements that we're talking about? And Iecc is essentially broken down into chapters by first components, and then kind of some different details on code compliance paths. I wanted to point out that the additional efficiency packages, C406, is something that, a lot of you, if you're using Iecc to show compliance, you're probably, or commonly folks use lighting additional efficiency packages, and those are something that's not present in Ashrae. So taking a quick look at the Ashrae organization, we see that we have the chapters are organized by components, so building envelope, HVAC, power, lighting, but there's more of the different paths are actually included within those chapters. And we'll notice that power and lighting are broken up. So if you're looking for those, that's where they are. And then that number 11, that's what we'll talk about in the next webinar on performance-based compliance. But otherwise, the different paths are kind of create the backbone in Ashrae of the organization for each of these components, which we will see here. So for power, we have mandatory provisions followed by different compliance paths. So whereas the performance, the energy cost budget is broken out, the other compliance paths are broken out within that chapter. So Iecc, it's a little bit more component based, and you'll see the required or the mandatory kind of mixed in with the prescriptive. So keep an eye out for that, be aware of it, and know that Section 8 and Section 9 are split up for power and lighting in Ashrae. So we have a quick poll just to kind of see where the audience is at, what kind of comfort level you guys have with Ashrae and Iecc. And then we'll talk quickly about the power. So have you used or seen the 90.1 compliance option? Have you used it at all? And then second question, just what is your comfort? Are you more knowledgeable about IECC or pretty equal. We were interested to know this just so that we craft the presentation to your interest. Cool, thanks for putting these answers in. Looks like people are tending to know the IECC better, but a lot of people know the both codes pretty well. So pretty even split, but we're definitely a little heavier on IECC. So we'll kind of try to fill in the Ashrae gaps for those of us who are more comfortable with IECC, which was about what we expected. Oh, let me put that up there. I'm sorry. There you go. And with that, we'll talk about power, so the electrical components before we jump into lighting. We'll first speak a bit about the Ashrae additions that are not in IECC. So first, and significantly, in the 2019 Ashrae, we are having automatic receptacle control is included. So at least half the receptacles in private offices, conference rooms, and rooms primarily used for printing or copying need to be automatically turned off based on time of day, like a schedule, occupant, or some other kind of control signal. And so if maybe this is a little bit in the future, but as we have BAS systems that are integrated with access controls, we might have a high-tech system where we know whether someone has entered the building or left the building and are controlling their outlets. And the reason for this is that we have more and more computers, monitors, plug loads that actually will draw current even when not in use. And so we want to just shut those outlets off to control that background power demand. And this is something that coming soon in IECC 2021. So we point this out as a difference here, but once we're adapting the new code, we're expecting to see this as well. And monitoring. So in the 2019 Ashrae, monitoring is necessary. We need to measure the devices. We need to measure the amount of energy use that is used, so total electrical energy, and then separately for HVA systems, for interior, exterior lighting, and for receptacles. And this is really is a great way to monitor things, to know what's going right, what's going wrong, to see if there's any changes, and make sure we're up to date on almost constantly commissioning our buildings through this monitoring. And again, coming soon, IECC 2021. So we flag this as a difference now, but we're going to come more into this with our new code cycle. Along with this monitoring, it's necessary that the code requires that we also do something with the monitoring. So if you have tenant spaces in a building, it's necessary to record and report that energy use so that it can be understood. So there needs to be some kind of graphical display for that reporting. And then something that's in Ashrae that's not in IECC is that there's for service water pressure boosting system. So if you have a pump to boost the water pressure, there's some pretty practical requirements for that, which don't come in IECC. In my opinion, if you're designing a service water pressure boosting system and you're not sure what to do, please reference Ashrae, even if you're not using it for compliance, because these are really good ways to reduce energy use for those systems, to make sure that when the water is not being used, the pumps are not operating and maintaining that pressure in an unoccupied building, and you're not reducing that pressure after creating it, except for safety reasons. And then controls to start and stop the pumps. Similarly, Ashrae has some requirements for clean water pumps in general, just how they should operate to efficiently move water. So if you have pumps in your building and not sure what are some good guidelines, please check out Ashrae for those guidelines, because they have a little more of that. And then in terms of things that show up in IECC but aren't in Ashrae, it's not a whole lot. One thing that we thought was worth noting is that escalators, which are probably also not super common, but in IECC, they're required to have regenerative drive for escalators. So if the escalator has folks who are going down, that they'll essentially push the folks up, who are going up. So if if you're designing escalators, this is a good thing to consider, in my opinion, regardless of the code that you're using to show compliance. So that's all that we wanted to share for power, but we had a quick poll question just to summarize the power requirements that we just covered, and then I'll hand it over to Ryan to introduce lighting requirements in Ashrae. So our poll, what categories need to be monitored under the 2019 Ashrae? So if you're using the current code, this may look like a tricky question, but remember, we're talking about the 2019. And then where is automatic receptacle control required? And the hint here is think about what we're trying to control and what rooms would have the biggest opportunity. So cool, looks like people are getting this one pretty well. So I'll go ahead and show those results. We have a lot to cover today. I hope I'm not moving too quickly, but yes, all of the above. So not only do you need to monitor total electrical energy, but also all these subgroups. So we'll need to have individual monitoring for those circuits to be able to diagnose when there's an increase or something might go wrong. And then the automatic receptacles are required in offices, conference rooms, classrooms, and especially like printer and copier rooms is one that's listed because they have a lot of the kind of equipment that would use power when it's not in use, that would draw a base load. So those kind of rooms are the ones we'll look for automatic receptacle control in. All right, with that, I will pass it to Ryan to discuss Ashrae lighting.
Thank you, Jane. So as far as Ashrae, understanding some of the differences for the prescriptive compliance paths, probably what a lot of people may be familiar with either through Ashrae or Iecc is the building area method. That's probably the most common used out there. Second would be the space by space method. That's perhaps a little bit more flexible, but a little more detailed for Iecc code path. Ashrae also has the simplified compliance path, which is only allowed for where 80% of the square footage is school, retail, or offices. So these are probably your more common space types. And understanding that those are there. One of the reasons why you might look to use that is just for simplifying things as far as the lighting power allowance. It specifies the specific lighting power allowance along with the controls that need to be used for that. And so for that, understanding that some of the control requirements, whether you have manual or auto on, where auto off is, and daylight harvesting controls where that might be. So again, that would be predominantly in retail that you might find that. And it also references for those who don't use that, then you get into the table 9.6.1, where it's a table of control strategies rather than, for each space, these are the controls that you need for that particular space. So we'll take a little bit deeper dive in that a little bit later. As noting, it does have specific requirements if you want to use this simplified path. Some of this is it's got to be at least 80% of the floor area is one of those three types: offices, retail, or schools. And it's for buildings that are smaller than 25,000 square feet. So this is, again, designed to be more for your simplified and more simple building designs. And so here's one of the tables here looking at offices, providing an allowance of 0.7 watts per square foot, which is a little bit higher than in the building area method. And again, for each space type here, specifying all spaces other than the parking garages, stairwells, and corridors, and then calls out what controls that you have or what controls that are needed. So again, the important thing is trying to keep things fairly straightforward and streamlined for you based on per space type for you. Similarly for exteriors, for here, most projects that you're going to be dealing with are in zones 2 and 3. Zone 4 is only found in specific locations within the city of Chicago here in the state of Illinois. And so that's, think Michigan Avenue, State Street, areas like that. Zone 0 and Zone 1, those are going to be rural and perhaps places that are very limited population, think national parks areas, those might be a zone 0 or 1. So most of your projects are going to be in zones 2 or 3. If you're not sure, reach out to your local code official or if it's not called out already in the design documents, which zone you're in. As you can see, the more populous you get, so as you're moving towards the higher and higher zone numbers, you get a little bit more allowance in these tables. So, something here that Ashrae does a little bit different for than Iecc is they call out this table a little bit differently as far as for here, it's focusing on how is these lights turning on, and then further over on the right, focusing on how are they turning off. Whereas Iecc kind of blends those two categories into one. And you might also see here at the top of the table where if a column, or if you have multiple columns that say add one, then you need to have at least one of these methods as part of your control strategy. And similarly, add two, you need to add at least one of those two. So again, when you're space by space or building area method, these control tables get a little bit more complicated for you. So, and here again, noting there's at least two different ones. And the table notes, again, Ashrae puts them at the top of your table, whereas normally you might look for them towards the bottom. So in this example, for a chapel for visually impaired residents, you'd need to have at least one either restricted to manual on or partial automatic on. And you would need to have automatic full off or scheduled shut off per the appropriate sections. So you'd need to have at least one of each of those, along with the others that are called out as required. So something else that's a little different between Iecc and Ashrae is with Ashrae, these are additive. So if you add some additional controls, you may have some additional power allowances for the lighting. Whereas the Iecc, they say, here is your allowance with all the controls. And then if you drive your budget down, then you can simplify and remove controls. There are particular controls in there. So Ashrae is a little bit additive, whereas Iecc is subtractive as far as the controls go. So, something else that Ashrae does do versus Iecc is they have this room geometry calculation. And so if you have unusually tall rooms and spaces, then you may have an extra 20% lighting power allowance for those spaces. And again, that's accounting for as the light travels through the room, you're going to be losing some of that through to the walls, and not all of it is reaching the occupant space. So this is something else that Ashrae does a little bit different, is if you have one of these unusual conditions, it adds to how much your lighting power is allowed to be. So here again, here's an example of that. Here we've got a room that's, you know, the total room height being 20 foot and the room cavity being 8 feet. And then you provide the calculation as far as, you know, what's my RCR and do I have an appropriate one? So it's our 2.5 times our room height cavity times the perimeter divided by the room area. So if you have an unusual geometry, this can help for that. So again, here we have a room cavity ratio, works out to 0.5. And in the table, in order to get that bonus, I need to have an RCR of at least 4. So unfortunately, I don't qualify here for the extra 20%, but hopefully we don't end up needing that. You know, here we're going to look at, you know, that was a square room. Here we're going to take a look at a rectangular room with a very tall ceiling, very narrow room. Here we get RCR of 4.4. So we are above my mark of 4. So I get an extra 20% of lighting power allowance for that. Again, with this, considering it's a very unusual geometry in that I've got a 35-foot mounting height and only a 15-foot room width. So some of these can be a little bit tricky to get to. As far as manual controls, again, Ashrae is very similar to the Iecc, except there's a little difference when it comes to some of these size requirements for your manual controls. Ashrae calling out that your control zone has to be no larger than 2,500 square foot versus 10,000 square foot. Or once your building or your space is larger than 10,000 square foot, then the zones have to be no larger than 10,000 square feet. And throughout the codes, they do call out several times exceptions for safety and security. So if you have particular safety or security concerns, again, make sure you're calling those out and clearly labeling where that requirement is in there. So not all lighting is for safety and security. It's not uncommon where you'll see on a floor, every 10th fixture or something where you just have barely some light for egress in the case of emergency. But throughout the code, it does call that out for safety and security, and obviously the life safety code applies. So that kind of takes care of Ashrae. So now we're going to move over into Iecc, and we'll take a look at some other sample rooms. Here's a sample room, 20 foot by 40 foot. It's appears to be a meeting space. Total lighting power of 200 watts, so a quarter watt per square foot. So fairly good as far as our lighting power density. 7.5 foot tall ceiling and the like, and 7.5 square foot windows. So we're going to be taking a look through these controls in the Iecc and focusing on this particular sample room to give you a little bit of an illustration. So as we walk through this, looking at this space, is continuous operation necessary for safety and egress? Given that space, we're probably not doing that. And so, we do need to look further for controls. Is it a small space at 300 square foot or less? Or does it have unpredictable occupancy? It was 800 square feet, so we're not a small space, but being a meeting space, we do have unpredictable occupancy. And so with that, because we've got a yes, we do need to add some occupant sensing controls. So that could either be an auto on to 50% or manual on to 100%. So health and safety is not an issue in this particular area. And so since we have occupant sensing controls, we don't need our time clocks. So next up, looking at daylight harvesting controls. First saying, is the space adjacent to windows that are at least 24 square feet in size or a skylight? In this location, we don't have that. As noted, the windows were only about 7.5 square feet. So, but if we assumed it was, the next question would be, does the fenestration, do we have at least 150 watts of electric light in the daylit zone? In that case, there was only 100 watts in the daylit zone in each of the 2 daylit zones. That is a little bit unusual because the room does face both sides, so you have 2 different daylit zones on the right and left. So since we only have 100 watts, we don't need daylight controls for that reason either. But just for the sake of argument and thoroughness, if we did, then looking at it and saying, is the overall lighting power density reduced by at least 40% of the maximum allowed? In this case, it's quite a bit lower. The 40% reduction would be a threshold in this case of 0.47 watts, or just under half a watt per square foot. As you might recall, for this space, it was only a quarter watt per square foot. So we're below that threshold well. So in this case, our sample room, all 3 doesn't need daylight harvesting controls for any of the 3 reasons. Only one of them has to apply to say you don't need it, but in this case, all 3 don't apply. As far as looking at exterior lighting, exterior lighting and how we control that, understanding, our first question, is it controlled from inside a dwelling unit? Understanding that you may have dwelling units in a commercial building. So these could be medium to high rise residential buildings, or mixed use buildings may also be classified as commercial buildings with residential dwelling units as occupancies. So looking at that and saying, if it's controlled from inside the dwelling unit, a balcony light or something like that, or is it a lighting required for vehicle entrance that you need for eye adjusting, then no setback is required. If it doesn't meet either of those, then you do need to have daylight controls, and depending on if it's decorative or not, so facade lighting is decorative, landscape lighting, and the like. If it is decorative, then you have to have timers to shut it off during non-business hours. If not, you do have to set them back during unoccupied times. So with that, I've got another poll question here to launch. The first question being, in the example meeting room that we walked through, which lighting controls were required? Occupant sensing, light reduction controls, manual controls, daylight controls, or time switch controls, which were required? And second, which of these locations do not require occupant sensing controls? Classrooms, laboratories, offices, spaces 300 square feet and less, so small spaces, or restrooms?
And while people are filling that out, we have a question in the Q&A. Thanks, Eric, for the question. And this is something we'll get to a little later, but how does the Iecc determine the ability of a fenestration to receive and transmit light? So we'll talk a bit more about daylighting controls when we get further down in controls. I think Ryan will talk about that towards the end of the presentation. But there are exceptions for windows that are blocked from natural light by, say, another building or a building feature, and the transmittability of the glass in both the codes. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ryan, at this point.
Not at this point. Well, yeah, we'll definitely cover that in more detail. And if we can clarify further, definitely make sure that we touch on that as we get further down.
Thanks for the question. Don't hesitate, everyone, to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat as you have them. We'll get to them when we can. And looks like we've got most of the answers in for the poll question here.
Let's go ahead and share those. So in our sample meeting room, we did need occupant sensing controls because it was unpredictable use. Light reduction controls were not required for that. Manual controls, that's a little bit, you do need manual controls even if you do have occupant sensing controls. So good pickup on that. And then daylight controls ended up not needing that due to fenestration size and watts and lumen lighting power density, and then did not need time switch controls. And as far as which locations do not require occupant sensing controls, laboratories is the big one there. Again, thinking safety. Classrooms, offices, and small spaces, and restrooms all require it. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to Jane to talk a little bit more about lighting controls.
Yeah, and we'll compare the two codes a little bit. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction to Ashrae and Iecc. As we could see, the way that you determine your controls in Ashrae and Iecc is very different. So, but we'll try to walk through how the outcomes are actually quite similar. So the big takeaway is we have quite a different way of presenting this information, and ultimately, to give it away at the beginning, you're going to end up with probably similar outcomes for your spaces, but as you can see, we have a very different list of controls. So one thing that I think I see as already being maybe somewhat difficult to grasp from the poll question, but is that in the Iecc, those occupant sensor controls are actually, they incorporate a few different controls in Ashrae. So the occupant sensing controls, if we look at C405.2.1, are required to do a few different things. So for the spaces which are listed in 405.2.1, these are classrooms, conferences, copy print rooms, lounges, break rooms, enclosed offices, open plan office areas, restrooms, storage rooms, locker rooms. It's a ton of different kinds of spaces, and significantly other spaces 300 square feet or less. So this is, and also warehouse storage areas, which have specific requirements. So it's a pretty long list. It's pretty exhaustive. And we like to think of it as any kind of space where there's sort of unpredictable expected occupancy, and where the space is sort of small enough to be controlled either in part or in whole with a occupant control. And then these, for larger spaces like open plan offices and warehouse spaces, those have specific provisions for how, even though they're big, how do we control them for occupancy. And then if we go on to 405.2.1.1, we see what occupant controls have to do. And they correspond to these add ones and add twos in Ashrae. So the occupant controls are required to turn lights off when people aren't there. So this can be, is required to be full off in most cases, but it does restrict the on. It doesn't, so for the C is a restriction to a partial partial automatic on. I'm sorry, this is my typo. So we can automatically turn lights on to 50%, but we're not allowed to automatically turn lights on to 100%. That has to be done manually by the occupant. So in Iecc, the occupant sensor controls incorporate a lot of the aspects of these separate controls that we see in the Ashrae tables. And hopefully that didn't make that more confusing. So next we have an easier one to kind of link up is time switch controls. So these are covered by Ashrae's scheduled shutoff and scheduled shutoff during non-business hours. So these are all covered under the Ieccc's time switch controls and the description of what those time switches need to do. And moving on, we have light reduction controls correspond to the bi-level lighting control. And we like to think of it as if you don't have a space that needs an occupant control, then it probably needs both time switch controls and light reduction controls. So those kind of come together. And in the occupant controls, we kind of have a light reduction built into that automatic on. But in Iecc, if we have a manual off, we're not required to have necessarily have light reduction controls with some of those spaces. So that might be something to keep in mind. And then the daylight responsive controls, that is broken down in Ashrae, but it's pretty clear cut. Side lights and top lights, which are broken out in this section in Iecc. And then manual controls are something that sort of comes first in Ashrae, and we sort of add on these other controls, whereas in Iecc, we kind of go from most spaces need this, some spaces are exempted and just need time switches. Some spaces are then going to need light reduction controls. And then we finally get to pretty much all spaces in both codes are requiring manual controls. So the way it's presented is a little different, but basically all spaces, there needs to be a manual way to turn the lights off, and then straightforward enough exterior and exterior. So another way to kind of conceptualize how these different controls relate to each other conceptually and in the two different codes is to look at it as local control. That's those manual controls is pretty much always required as some way to turn off the lights. Plus, we have automatic off or timers and manual controls. So the automatic off is the occupant controls. So for those spaces that are listed, the offices, classrooms, conference rooms, copy rooms, any space that's 300 square feet or less, we're going to require an automatic off. And we're going to be limited with an automatic on to 50%. Or in spaces that don't require that. So spaces maybe are some of our hallways, some of our special kinds of classrooms, lobbies, other such spaces that are exempted from occupant controls are going to need to have timers that relate to the schedule of the building, and then also some kind of manual control. In addition to these sort of occupant related controls that are making sure that lights are off when when occupants aren't there, that the lights are off when they're not there to benefit. We also have some kind of light reduction control in Iecc, and this is pretty much either daylight controls or light reduction controls. Our daylight controls do need to provide some light reduction, essentially to reduce the electric light when daylight is present. But in spaces that aren't in daylit areas or where daylighting controls aren't required for some of the reasons that Ryan pointed out, this is commonly the daylight controls aren't required for various exceptions. We will need to have light reduction controls if these areas aren't already on an automatic off. So hopefully that it spells out in some kind of clear way the organization of these controls and some of the logic in Iecc. And now I'll flip over to show how that logic compares to what we see in Ashrae. So if you remember, we have that table with a whole bunch of columns of different kinds of controls with the add one and add two. So we pretty much always have on the left local control, plus we're going to have some kind of occupant and vacancy controls. So this relates to that question: are occupants present to benefit from the light? And that relates to columns B, C, G, H, and I. So those are the add twos and the add ones, which are the manual on and the automatic off, or limit to automatic on and automatic off when people aren't there. So that's that occupant controls. And then we also have automatic partial off, which is sometimes required in Ashrae, and then automatic full off. So some spaces are required to have an automatic full off. And if that's required, we're not going to see, of course, the option for an automatic partial off or the scheduled off, because we're going to have an automatic full off. So this maybe guides us through a little bit more clearly, but it also really breaks down these controls into a whole lot more granule level. And in Ashrae, again, we still have this question of light level controls, and they relate to each other a little bit differently in the Ashrae 2019. I think one of the ways that we might conceptualize the difference in both the from 2016 Ashrae to 2019 and from 2018 IECC to 2021 is that we're really coming into the LED era. So we're going to have more requirements for things like continuous dimming, more requirements for turning on and off lights, as we're assuming 100% LED, which is a little bit easier to control in those ways. So in the 2019 IECC, we see, and we'll look at some examples of this, but whereas there's an exception in IECC for light level controls aren't required where there are daylight controls, we sometimes see both bi-level light controls and daylight controls required in Ashrae. And this is essentially like if your bi-level lighting control is only calling for 50% for your dimmer or such, that the daylighting controls aren't allowed to ramp up the lights beyond that point. And similarly, if the occupant has a dimmer, they should not be able to put up the dimmer beyond a level of light that's called for by the daylighting controls in their settings. So hopefully that's helpful framework, and we will now take a look at an example from first the Ashrae perspective and then try to walk it through with the IECC. And like I mentioned, most of the time these are probably going to come out to very similar outcome, but this is an example where there's a slight difference in the outcome. So, well, maybe I gave it away. So we're looking at a conference room, and our method, if we are looking for our lighting controls and our lighting power density allowance for a conference meeting multi-purpose room, we're going to go to the table in Ashrae as long as we're not using the simplified method. So we'll go to the table, we'll find conference meeting multi-purpose room, and we'll just simply look at the different tables and see what's required. And we see that in this case, an automatic full off is required. So we're not going to be allowed the option to have an automatic partial off in this case. And that's totally in line with, well, what we'll see in IECC. And then the automatic on, we can either choose, we have the option in this case, we have an add one. So we can choose to have a manual on. So there's no automatic on, the occupant has to turn the light on manually, and then they can turn it to 100%. Or we are restricted to a partial automatic on with the occupant being able to manually increase that light level to 100%. But the partial automatic on has to be only to 50%. So the one, if our conference room has a daylit area, we see that we are required to have automatic daylight responsive controls if that applies, based on the zones, which Ryan will introduce us to a little bit later, but so that's required for side lighting and top lighting. But we also see that we're required to have bi-level lighting control. So this is where it could be a little bit different than the IECC, which we will now look at. Oh, and there's calling it out. So this bi-level lighting control, if that's where I want you to pay a little attention, because this might be a little bit different in IECC. It's kind of a small difference here. So we're now considering the same conference meeting multi-purpose room from the IECC perspective to kind of largely what we're comparing here is we're going to have a similar outcome, but we want to see how different the logic is, how we get there. So in IECC, we're essentially going through the list of requirements of controls and seeing whether they apply to our space, rather than if we jump back to Ashrae, we see we started from the space that we had. So we had conference meeting multi-purpose room, and then it's kind of spelled out for us. In IECC, we're going to start with 405.2.1, the first control, and we're going to see if it applies or if any of the exceptions apply. So the one exception is it continuously necessary to are the lights continuously necessary for egress, such as with a fire stair or something that might be continuously necessary? No, that's not the case here. So we go on to say, our occupant sensor controls required, and we see, yeah, it is. It's specifically listed, actually, our conference meeting multi-purpose room. So we see that the occupant controls are in fact required. So those occupant controls per 405.2.1.1, they shall be manual on. So they have to be a full manual on, or they can automatically turn on to no more than 50% power. So that's essentially our choose one. If we come back to Ashrae, that's our add one. So we're restricted to manual on or partial automatic on. So same thing, different way to present the information. And we're required to have that automatic off when occupants haven't been in the space for a period of time. So for daylighting rooms, for this same, looking at it from the IECC perspective, they are required if the space is adjacent to the fenestration, if it has a significant enough amount of power, which is the same as Ashrae. But then we have an exemption in IECC that we don't see in Ashrae, which is the overall lighting power density in the daylit areas of our whole building reduced by 40% or more from the maximum allowed. So this is something we'll talk about later, but that's a difference that we wanted to point to. Our meeting room in IECC might have another opportunity to simplify controls based on having lower lighting power density. So also with which I pointed to earlier with Ashrae, we saw that we required light reduction controls and daylight controls. In IECC, we see that if we have light reduction controls are not required in the daylight zones. So that might, for specific spaces, maybe that would create a little bit of a difference. In our case, we're not really required to have light reduction controls anyways, because we're in the occupant controls. So not in a timer, but that could be a slight difference between the two codes. And hopefully the big takeaway is that the process is very different, but we end up having very similar outcome, but could be some slight differences. So this is just reviewing and being able to see visually some of what is that first step? What are occupant sensing devices are required in what spaces? So this is the list. It's, rather than memorizing this list, I think of it as spaces where there's intermittent occupancy, where controlling lights would have an opportunity. So classrooms, lectures, training rooms, conference, meeting, multi-purpose rooms, copy print rooms, lounges, break rooms, enclosed offices, open plan offices, but they have their own requirements, restrooms, storage areas, locker rooms, and other spaces 300 square feet or less. And then warehouse storage areas also have special requirements. And we're looking to see more hallways and more special, more explanation about hallways in 2021. So keep an eye out for that. We do have a question before we move on to daylighting zone definitions. For partial automatic on, can 50% of the light to be, for the automatic on, can half the light to be switched to 100%? So if we have in IECC, and we can discuss this later when we take a break, but we have the option of having a full manual on. So, if we have occupant sensors, such as in an office space, my understanding would be that you wouldn't be required necessarily to have that bi-level lighting control. So moving on to daylighting zone definitions, and this is something that the codes define quite clearly, but also very similarly. So the one difference that or one inclusion in Ashrae that is not made it maybe quite as clear in IECC is how to deal with skylights above multi-story spaces. So this is just a definition that's included in Ashrae that we thought we'd pull out as something that is not necessarily different, but is a clarification in Ashrae. And then another thing, which is something that came into the 2019 Ashrae and that we're actually expecting to see in the 2021 Iecc, is that there's a secondary side lighted area. So if we meet the requirements for daylighting in this primary zone as defined in the picture, we also have possibly the requirement to control daylighting in a secondary side lit zone. And this is based on the requirement to meet a certain threshold of 150 watts in each area. So if there's 300 watts within the primary and secondary side lighted area, we do need to have daylighting zones if there isn't some other exception, and that those need to be controlled separately. So if, depending on how the light is moving, it could be a different amount of light is falling on the primary side lighted zone and secondary. So those daylighting controls need to be separate. Also, there's a consideration for projection factor in the side light calculations, which isn't clarified in Iecc. There's also, I wanted to see, in the 2021 Iecc and also in 2019 Ashrae, we see more requirement for continuous dimming with the daylight responsive controls. So there's more requirement to have a gradient between on and off. And that is a response, I think, again, to the more inclusion of LEDs and better digital and dimming capabilities. So reviewing this table again, this is from the Ashrae user manual for 2019, showing how the simplified building method, which Brian was introduced, relates to some of these controls. Seemed like it's a helpful way to review how these controls are the same and different than Ashrae. So comparing the two codes, we see that in terms of lighting power density, we have a building area method and also a space by space method. That's the same in both codes. And those methods have similar pros and cons. So for most spaces, the building area method, its benefit is that it's simpler, it's easier to show compliance, but there's more flexibility allowed in the space by space. That's the same in both codes. The interior lighting power density allowance exceptions are different. So this gets the pink color because it's different. As Ryan pointed out, this is actually a pretty significant difference between the two codes, where the Ashrae lighting power density is additive. If you add more controls, you can add more allowance, lighting power allowance. In Ashrae, it's subtractive. If you do better than the prescribed lighting power density, you can reduce some of your controls. So don't make the mistake of directly comparing a lighting power density from Ashrae with one from Iecc, because the other prescriptions in the code are going to affect that lighting power density a little bit differently. Partial or manual on required in most spaces. This is true for both codes. It's written out differently, but we saw that the occupant sensor controls in C405 in Iecc was very similar to the choose one and choose two columns in Ashrae. And then that automatic off control, same thing, it's broken out in Ashrae, but it falls under that occupant sensor controls. And then daylighting controls, pretty much the same. There's a few maybe subtleties in that some of those are between the 2019 version and the 2016 as well, but there's a few subtleties that are bringing us into the LED era there, and some differences in how the daylighting relates to the light level controls, but mostly these are the same. They're going to be required in similar areas. one significant difference is that the simplified building method is allows a pretty significant exception for daylighting control, and that in IECC we see a significant exception for daylighting for reduced lighting power density, as Ryan was discussing, and we'll look at some examples of that. So with that, I think we have another poll question to throw up, and then I will hand it to Ryan to discuss lighting power density. And with that, a little bit of review of some of these controls with some examples. So poll number 4, question 1, the bi-level lighting controls in Ashrae 2019 are more specific in requiring a setting between 0 and 100%. And then question 2, which code allows an exception for daylighting controls for a total lighting power density in daylighting zones that's at least 40% below the code maximum? So this is reviewing some of those differences between the two codes. Which code allows you to get out of daylighting controls for reduced lighting power density in your zones throughout the building? And then which code requires more intermediate setting between 0 and 100? Is that Ashrae 2019 or Iecc 2018?
And kind of touching as far as the question about the partial on to 50%, can you turn on certain fixtures to 100% to satisfy the requirement? Yes, you can. It is based on the wattage in the input power, and so yeah, you can turn on half the lights in an even pattern to 100%, or if you have fixtures of varying wattages, you might have some decorative lighting or others, understanding that, and so your limit is 50% of the area wattage. So you might choose which fixtures you turn on for that, if you do want to just use on and off rather than dimming or stepped control.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ryan. So we'll go ahead and share this poll. I think maybe we can have confused you between the different codes. The code that allows an exception for daylighting controls for a reduced lighting power density, that's Iecc. So if you're 40% below the required lighting power density in your daylighting zones, that's Iecc. Ashrae has an exception for the simplified building method, where most daylighting controls are not required if you follow that simplified method. So they're similar outcomes probably, but different method to get there. And then bi-level lighting controls in Ashrae 2019 are more specific in requiring a setting between 0 and 100%, and that's true. I think we'll see that in the 2021 Iecc, but Ashrae 2019 is already there with requiring more intermediate steps. So with that, I'll pass it to Ryan to discuss lighting power density.
Thank you, Jane. All right, as we're moving in for dwelling units, there's a little bit of a difference. Again, Ashrae 90.1 is only in commercial buildings, but you may have dwelling units within those commercial buildings. Ashrae still has a limit of 75% of the permanently installed lighting fixtures shall be high efficacy lighting, whereas Iecc is a little bit higher at 90%, and also, as Jane noted, coming soon to the Iecc for 2021, that is moving to 100%. Understanding that high efficacy lighting is readily available, and really there's not a lot of reasons why you would have non-high efficacy lighting sources needed anymore, given dimming and how that has come along. Now, IECC will be adding an exception for cooking appliance lighting, understanding that those areas are high temperature and therefore not appropriate to LEDs. But for most buildings, and I think most buildings have kind of gone the way of LEDs anyway, just even if it's not so much from the energy side, but just the maintainability and maintenance savings due to their much longer lifespan. So IECC does have a few different exceptions for lighting power density. Again, here noting in the simplified method, or that this doesn't apply in the simplified method. But if you are using the area method, then you have some additional lighting required controls. Also, as Jane alluded to, local control is generally always needed for most anything. Again, wanting to make sure that the occupants can turn things off. Ashrae does specify a lot of these. Some of these, like item number 2 here, specifically designed for use during medical or dental procedures. IECC generally looks just at general area lighting. They don't focus on the task lighting, and so normally these medical or dental procedure lights, they already have fixture mounted. They're appliance lights. They're not your general room illumination. So IECC kind of avoids and leaves a lot of this out as far as saying you need local controls, because most all of these come with local controls already. So IECC for lighting power density, when you're doing your calculation, IECC just lists a bunch of areas as far as, these you don't have to include in your calculation for your lighting power density. But it doesn't necessarily get into the controls of these. So, your TV broadcast lighting, again, IECC says this is a specialty application. This is not your general room illumination. And so they just go through and say these lights, don't include them in your lighting power density calculation for purposes of your energy code compliance. And again, most of this list is specialty applications, TV broadcasts, food warming, advertising, plant growth. This is not general illumination for human occupants. Anyway, they have a specific purpose. Now, IECC may go into some controls in specific application controls, where some of these they say you need to control these separate from your general illumination, such that your cleaning crews, as they come through, need to be able to turn on the general illumination, but I don't necessarily need to turn on all the sales displays for cleaning purposes. So that is one quite a difference between the two. Also here noting, the building area method versus the space by space. There's a little bit more generosity as far as the space by space method as compared to, the building area method. And this is very similar to both Ashrae and IECC as far as what these, the difference between space by space and building area. That's very similar between the two. And here we see, a hospital gets your just over 1 watt per square foot, whereas in healthcare, when we're dealing with space by space, you'll see several of these, operating rooms and exam rooms are higher than that 1 watt per square foot. But then you have other spaces that are likely also found in there, your supply closets and your patient rooms that have a much lower density. So overall, space by space might get you a little bit extra, but again, now you're having to go through and calculate rather than just, here's my building area, multiply it by my lighting power density, one calculation, I'm done. Space by space, having to go through and categorize every room, it's a lot more time consuming, but might get you a little bit. So if you're right on the bubble, you might see if space by space might work for you. But again, with the push towards LEDs, we haven't run into too many places where you need that extra push to get you over that allowance. So, and again, noting, earlier we had that example, we're getting somewhere in the 35, 40 foot candles, with a quarter watt per square foot. In a lot of times we can even see, even at 0.4 watts per square foot, easily being able to get 45 foot candles, which is generally acceptable for most purposes out there. So, being aware that there are some differences in the lighting power densities, Ashrae appears on the surface to be a little more stringent than IECC. But again, as Jane alluded to earlier, Ashrae is additive, where if you add some additional controls, you can gain a little bit extra of your lighting power allowance, where IECC says if you get below, you push your lighting budget down, will allow you to remove controls. So again, Ashrae being additive and IECC being subtractive, they're going to be in a fairly similar ballpark. And mostly this ends up being, so the lighting doesn't see a whole lot of dramatic differences. We don't see too many projects being pushed, because of the lighting, I'm going Ashrae or I'm going IECC. Some of the areas that we do see that push generally is more in the power side, and saying, I don't want to deal with automatic receptacle control. Let me go over to IECC because they don't have it. A lot of those big differences are kind of going away with the upcoming version. So it's going to be more, what are you comfortable with? What are you used to? And that'll kind of, push you in one direction or another. So as we're going over, Jane mentioned that open plan offices do have specific requirements to themselves in the IECC, whereas Ashrae doesn't get into quite the nitty gritty that IECC does. Whereas IECC, you need to reduce the lighting power. Again, they focus on connected lighting power rather than fixture count by 80% when a zone is unoccupied, and then once all zones in that open plan office is unoccupied, the remaining 20% need to go off. So, and understanding that either could be each individual zone just controls 100% and we're done, or you might interlink the different zones so that the whole area knows when there's no zones remaining occupied. So also a note here about daylight controls. This seems like it should be fairly straightforward. The daylight controls should be there to reduce lighting levels when there's appropriate daylighting, not bringing them on when there's not enough daylight. We don't want to necessarily end up with this backwards, where the daylight controls are now bringing on the lights at night. That's not their purpose. So, whereas when you get into Ashrae, all they do is specifying that, hey, we need to bring the lights on only to 50%, and then the occupant has the ability to go ahead and raise it more. Or Ashrae, as far as their exception, they say, they call this out as, this is a space where you can go past the 100% automatic on. So a little bit of a difference in how they phrase it, but practically speaking, both of them allow open plan offices to turn on when someone comes in. So you don't end up with that, you can only go on to 50%. Well, where's the light switch? The light switch is way over there to turn on this cubicle section. So that's not terribly practical. So when we get into time switch controls, under IECC. IECC is one area where they bring in and say, you need time switch controls. One place is wherever you don't have occupant sensors. It went through the list of, here are all the places you must have occupancy sensors. And then if you don't, then you need this time switch control. So that's one little thing with IECC is saying, if a space isn't necessarily on that list of spaces that must have occupant sensing controls, but you don't want to put the space on a time switch, you can add occupant sensing controls to avoid that. So, and very similar, again, these safety aspects come into play. We don't want to have time switches turning off where you have patient care directly provided, not just a space that a patient may be through, but where you are actually providing the care, and safety and security for that. So we go over to Ashrae. Ashrae does allow an exception for time switch controls. They say, hey, you can basically take enough fixtures off such that you're not over 0.02 watts per square foot. Kind of what this is looking at is that safety, life safety, egress. I need to keep that light fixture on. So that's kind of how Ashrae has kind of done it based on this 0.02 watts per square foot. So if you take a modern 20 watt LED fixture, you can leave one of those on for every 1,000 square feet. So that's, again, this is designed to be egress lighting. We're not trying to light the building with this 0.02 of a watt per square foot. Light reduction controls, we kind of started to touch on this with that question, making sure that we're reducing the light. In IECC, it says just by not less than 50%. And so, be it you can do dimming, alternating luminaires, however you kind of want to get there. The important part is 50% of lighting power needs to be able to be reduced in a reasonable form or fashion. Here again, IECC, as we kind of noted, these are subtractive. So if you get low lighting power density, below that 0.6 watts per square foot, you can avoid needing these light reduction controls. However, we still recommend that every space have a local light switch so someone can turn the lights off when they don't need it. And a few different locations. Again, corridors and lobbies, it's not practical to have bi-level controls in those areas, generally speaking. You can, but generally you don't see them there. Ashrae, here they've specified that you have to have at least one intermediate step between 30 and 70%. That's one thing that IECC, and maybe this will be cleaned up in the future, IECC says, you have to have, it has to be reduced by at least 50%. Off is 100%, which is at least 50%. Ashrae has said, come on, guys. Light reduction doesn't mean off. So Ashrae has specified, we want it to, there needs to be a step somewhere in the 50%-ish range. 30 to 70% gives you a little bit of flexibility and leeway. Also, again, for spaces where you might have some spaces where you have 2x4 and 2x2 different fixtures. And so saying, I might not be able to hit 50% on the money, but I can do, roughly half of the area. So daylight harvesting, and this is something that's been in Ashrae for a while, as well as IECC. This is looking at the IECC. Here they're calling out a single daylighting zone, being one head height in from the window. Whereas Ashrae, we actually have two. We have a primary daylight zone, which is one in, and then a secondary daylight zone that is a second head height in. So being aware of that, these images do come directly out of the IECC code book. So very handy. Again, reminder that if you're trying to find these, we do have links to the codes directly on our website for ease of access. Here we have some exceptions as far as side lighting. Again, how the two, the code versus the standard, IECC versus Ashrae 90.1, they present them a little differently, but they are fairly similar. One of the perhaps one of the larger differences here, noting that the glazing area threshold is 20 square feet in Ashrae versus 24 in IECC. So a little bit of a difference there. 4 foot by 5 foot windows versus 4 foot by 6 foot windows to trigger that. And Ashrae goes ahead and provides the exception directly in the projection factor, whereas IECC comes in and provides it as an exclusion for other provisions that might block access to daylight. Again, with that projection factor, understanding, it has to be far enough out and close enough to that window such that it's kind of shading that window. And so that may help from an HVAC perspective, having that projection out there to shield those windows from that sunlight, particularly in the summer, but you're going to be trading that off, and it may preclude some daylight harvesting controls from being used. So a little bit of a trade-off there. I don't want to necessarily guess which trade-off is going to be better as far as the mechanical benefit versus the trade-off you're getting on the lighting, not being able to harvest that daylighting, but I'm probably thinking mechanical might win on that one. Again, IECC does cover top-lit zones. Jane touched on earlier, Ashrae does have, when you have multi-story atriums, IECC doesn't have that at this point in time. That's coming in the 2021 version. But IECC does have for your roof monitors and skylights. So it's a little, maybe a little bit difficult to understand, but this is, the daylight zone extends 70% of the ceiling height, flopped out from the skylight perimeter. So here again for the top lighting, here Ashrae calls out if the skylight is smaller than 20 square feet, it doesn't count, whereas IECC doesn't get into that. It just gets into visual transmittance and things such as that. Now, is what IECC does allow for, again, these trade-offs here, is saying if you have low power density, then you may be able to avoid needing to have skylights. So otherwise you may be forced, if you have a building of an appropriate size and square footage and height, IECC says you need to put in your skylights, which then you need to have your daylight harvesting controls, or get your lighting power density down, and then you can avoid needing the skylights, which then avoids the need to have daylight harvesting controls for the skylights that you didn't need anymore. So that is something to be a little bit cognizant of. So again, as we try to call out frequently, is, we definitely like the approach of the simpler I can make a building, the better it is. So the daylight exception in the IECC can be a very strong exception. So if you can drive down your lighting power density by the weighted weighted average area in the daylit zone, then you don't have to purchase, install, commission, and maintain the daylighting controls for that. So again, this is one, rarely do I like to see an exception, but this is one that if we can avoid it, can be very helpful and beneficial. So trying to put this in perspective, because it's 40% of the weighted area. So looking at it in the first example, half of the square footage is in the daylit zone. And so if I'm able to drive down my lighting by 20%, half of 40, then I'm done with my daylighting. I don't have to purchase, install, commission, and maintain daylight harvesting controls. Again, in an office, 0.63 watts per square foot, highly doable. You can generally get there without too much effort. Again, looking at the daylight zones using top lit, again, whether you're doing time clocks or occupant sensors, if you have at least 150 watts in the top lit or side lit zone, you need to add your daylight harvesting controls. So with that, getting into retrofits, this is where we have a lot of questions come in regarding retrofits. When do I need to? When do I not? Ashrae calls out that if you are touching 20% or less of the fixtures in a space, then you don't need to worry too much about your lighting power density. Just make sure that you are not increasing the lighting power, which isn't too hard. They also exclude if all you're doing is replacing lamps and ballasts in the existing fixture. You don't have to worry about adding additional controls and things like that. And obviously, routine and repair and maintenance doesn't qualify as far as needing to bring the system up to the current code standards as far as controls and things like that. Iecc, it's a little lower. Ashrae says 20% or less. Iecc says less than 10% of the luminaires in a space. So for a lot of these, if you're upgrading the lighting, you probably need to go ahead and add your controls. Fortunately, with occupant sensing controls and a lot of new luminaires coming with built-in controls, that's becoming less problematic. Iecc also has a very similar exception where if all you're doing is bulbs and ballasts in the existing fixtures, those are repairs and so therefore not covered by the code. Looking at a couple of examples to again see how this works out. So looking at a 5,000 square foot, a tenant is leaving most of the lighting, but there's a few different rooms that they want to change. Again, considering spaces, not building area. So going down from 1600 watts down to 900 watts, how does this apply to it? And what it kind of looks at is saying in the spaces that you're going to replace your lighting, you need to go ahead and add your controls. So even though it's only a small square percentage of the total building, so I might not reach the 20% of the building, I'm touching more than 20% in a space. So again, that's where you get into what are you touching? Go ahead and bring that up. Iecc is very similar in that, whatever you touch and whatever you're changing, go ahead and bring it up to the current standards. That doesn't mean that because I changed the lighting fixtures, now I need new windows. That's not part of this. That is, if you're doing lighting, you go ahead and bring the lighting up to the standard. So let's look at a example out in a parking lot. Here I got 10,000 square foot. We're going to call out, we're in lighting zone 3. Going to do a lamp and ballast job, upgrading the LEDs. on the existing poles and the luminaires. So presently, just a regular time switch. No, it's not an astronomical time clock, so it doesn't change with the seasons or anything like that. Does this apply? And what they're calling out is saying, here you do need to comply with your lighting zone power allowance. So make sure that we're doing that. But again, your lighting controls, since all you're doing is lamps and ballasts in the existing fixtures, you don't have to go ahead and upgrade your controls at that point in time. Now, what might be wise in this, if you're doing this, again, noting I have a time clock without astronomical, you might think about adding a photo cell in series with it. So you might look at that to try to avoid having your expensive LED fixtures operating when it's warm out in the heat of the day. So once the sun goes down, it's less likely to cook your LEDs. So again, as we're looking over at Iecc, again, they're exempting if you do bulb and ballast and you're not increasing the lighting power. We're just counting that as repairs, so we're not going to concern ourselves with that. So it does make it a little simpler. Again, what most of this is if you're touching it, try to bring it up to the current standard, and even if it's not necessarily required, it may be highly beneficial to do so and use the standard as far as guidance and say, what would be good practice and what is feasible in here, even if I don't necessarily have to by the letter of the law. Good for your client. One of the other big, this is when you're talking lighting power, and this be about the end of lighting power, but track lighting is where there's a huge difference between the two. Ashrae standard for track lighting and plug-in busway is 30 watts per linear foot. So if I have a 8-foot track, that's automatically 240 watts of connected power, or whatever the fixtures are, whichever is greater. Iecc has said, we're going to call it 8 watts per foot, or whatever's connected to it, whichever's greater. So again, that 8-foot track would be 240 watts in Ashrae versus 64 watts in Iecc. Trying to put 30 watts of LED on a track, that could be a little bit tough, and if nothing else, very bright. So something to be aware of, that if you're if you're running into challenges with your lighting power, it may be, if you have a lot of track lighting, that could be catching you up here. So with that, I believe I've got a final poll here. And that is, first question, a lighting power allowance in Ashrae is necessarily stricter than a higher allowance in the Iecc. Yes, it always is, or it depends on the controls selected and the room geometry. And the second question, has today's presentation improved your understanding of Ashrae 90.1 and or Iecc? Very much, somewhat, not so much. I'm confused more now than before. So looks like we got a question in here. If I change the lighting in a 500 square foot conference room in a 25,000 square foot office building that does not meet Iecc or Ashrae control from a controls standpoint, will I need controls and a control system for the conference room? So if I change the lighting in a conference room, do I have to bring the controls up to the current standard?
Yeah, this is a good question. And that's what where Ryan was saying, that it's space by space. So, looking at the definition of a space, the conference room would be a space. So if you change the lighting in the conference room, controls in the conference room are required to comply with the code. But that doesn't mean that the rest of your 25,000 square foot office building would need to comply with any aspect of the code. It's just what you're touching, and it's space by space.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, do you have anything to add to that, Ryan? Or
Yeah, and probably what a lot of that controls might be is you would end up seeing, a wall-mounted occupancy sensor or a ceiling-mounted occupancy sensor would be all that would be required. It doesn't require you to go back and outfit the whole office building with a controls system. Yeah, that's.
And if you just did bulbs and ballasts, then you would not be required to comply with the code controls for either code.
There you go.
And luckily, it looks like we only confused 3 people, which is perhaps a little miraculous. Thank you guys for bearing with us with comparing all these different nuances in lighting controls and power density. We appreciate you being here today, and please do join us for the next webinar about performance-based compliance in the 2 codes, comparing those. And we will, we have one more question in the chat. We will have a recorded version of this webinar. So hopefully you can unconfuse yourselves if you got confused. And we will send that out with the email. And look for that email too for your continuing education credits. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.